I'm Emily, and I work as a child psychologist. Ever since I was little, I've had two loves, my dad and books. My dad, George, runs a big publishing house, and I practically grew up in those stacks of manuscripts and the smell of fresh ink. Life's funny that way, sticking you right where you belong from the start. Every month, like clockwork, I'd tag along with Dad to his office. It was our thing, end of the work week, and we'd grab dinner after, just him and me. That particular Friday started no different. The office buzzed with the usual energy of deadlines and last-minute deals. I was sitting in Dad's office, flipping through a manuscript that was probably too old for me, when he walked in with someone. "Emily, this here is Jacob. He's got a knack for stories, but hasn't found his rhythm yet," Dad introduced us. Jacob was a bit rough around the edges, jeans, a bit scruffy, but his smile was something else. He carried a manuscript under his arm, clearly well-handled, with dog-eared pages sticking out. "Nice to meet you, Emily. Heard a lot about you. Your dad can't stop bragging about his brilliant daughter," Jacob said, extending his hand. I shook it, feeling a little flush. "Nice to meet you too. Hope Dad's not overselling me." We laughed, and Dad clapped his hands, pleased. "I'll leave you two to chat. Emily, why don't you show Jacob around? Might do him good to see the place through someone who loves it as much as you do." As we walked through the corridors, I could feel Jacob's curiosity peeking at every corner. "So, you really like coming here? Doesn't it get, I dunno, boring?" "Not really," I shrugged. "Each book is like a new world. Isn't that what drew you to writing?" He chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, something like that. But it's tough, you know? Trying to make a living out of worlds in your head." We ended up in the cafeteria, and I bought us 2 coffees. As we sat, Jacob's gaze was pensive, his fingers drumming on the table. "You ever think about writing yourself? You know so much about this stuff." "Maybe," I admitted, sipping my coffee. "But right now, I'm more into helping kids. They've got their own stories, you know?" "Makes sense," Jacob nodded. "Hey, thanks for showing me around, Emily. Feels less intimidating now." As we walked back to Dad's office, something about Jacob's hopeful, almost vulnerable look struck me. Maybe it was his determination or just his easy way of talking. Whatever it was, I found myself wanting to see him succeed. Driving home later, Dad couldn't stop talking about Jacob. "There's something about that boy. Reminds me of myself when I started out. Raw, but something golden there." I smiled, looking out the window, the city lights blurring by. "Yeah, Dad. I think he'll make it." Little did I know, that day wasn't just another end of the week. It was the beginning of everything, of love, of dreams, of the twisted roads we'd soon walk. After Jacob and I got married, life took a turn, not just sideways, but upside down. His books weren't selling. Money was tight, and tensions were high. I started running after-school clubs and taking extra shifts, anything to make ends meet. We were living on dreams and instant noodles, pretty much. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found Jacob slumped over his desk, papers scattered around like the aftermath of a storm. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Em. Maybe I'm not cut out for writing," he muttered, shuffling through his failed manuscript pages. Sitting beside him, I grabbed his hand. "Look, everyone hits a rough patch. Maybe you just need a fresh pair of eyes, or a new angle." He scoffed, almost bitterly. "And what? Start writing kiddie books?" "Why not?" I challenged. "You're good at making up stories, and kids love that stuff. Plus, I can help. I know what kids like, remember?" The next day, I talked to Dad about it. We were in his office, the usual clutter of books and manuscripts surrounding us. "Dad, Jacob's struggling with his books. What if he tried writing for children?" I ventured, hoping it didn't sound as desperate as I felt. George, ever the pragmatist, leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "It's a tough market, Em. But it might be his only shot. I'll give him a tip or two, see what he can whip up. So, we started. Our dining table turned into a brainstorming hub. I'd throw ideas at Jacob, and he'd run with them, his typewriter clacking away into the night. Hey, what about a story of a little boy who builds a rocket from cardboard boxes and goes to Mars? I suggested one evening, excited by the thought. Jacob looked up from his typewriter. And what, he fights aliens or discovers a new planet? No, it's about his adventure, the friends he makes along the way. Keep it simple, relatable, I explained, trying to steer him towards empathy rather than action. Could work. Kids like that adventurous stuff, right? Jacob mused, warming up to the idea. Months of trial and error followed. We wrote together, scrapped ideas, and argued over characters and plots. It was messy, frustrating, and absolutely wonderful. One morning, Jacob slid a finished manuscript across the table to me. Read it. It's called Tommy's Trip to Mars. Think it'll fly? I read it, cover to cover, and looked up, finding his anxious gaze. It's perfect. It's going to soar, not just fly. Jacob's first children's book did more than just soar, it skyrocketed. One night, as we celebrated the news of his first sold-out book signing, Jacob pulled me close, his breath warm against my ear. Couldn't have done it without you, Em. This is all you. I laughed, a bit tipsy from the champagne and the joy. It's all us, babe. We're in this together, remember? That night, as we fell asleep, our hands entwined, the weight in my chest felt lighter. We were making it, together. It felt like we'd conquered the world, with just a typewriter and a handful of dreams. Life's got a funny way of giving you exactly what you need when you least expect it. After Jacob's book took off, things started looking up, but it wasn't the book sales or the newfound stability that changed everything. It was the day we found out I was pregnant. I remember telling Jacob. It was a chilly evening, and he was at his desk, sketches and notes scattered around like always. I walked over, holding the test behind my back. Jacob, I've got news, I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't look up, just kept scribbling. Yeah? What's up? Big news, I emphasized, now waving the pregnancy test like a white flag. That caught his attention. He glanced up, saw the stick in my hand, and his face went white, then red, then a weird mix of both. Are you serious? Are we? Yep, we're going to be parents, I grinned, my heart hammering in my chest. He got up so fast, his chair almost toppled over. Coming over, he hugged me, tight like he'd never let go. This is amazing. And it was. Those 9 months flew by in a haze of preparations, doctor's appointments, and Jacob turning our spare room into the perfect nursery. He'd often stand in the doorway, paintbrush or wallpaper in hand, and say something like, "Do you think the baby will like stars or moons better on the ceiling?" I'd laugh, watching him fuss. Babe, as long as the room is warm and the crib doesn't squeak, our baby will sleep just fine under either. When Sophie was born, it was like our little world finally felt complete. Holding her for the first time, I felt a love so fierce, it almost scared me. Jacob was the same, he'd hover around her like she was the most precious thing. Which, of course, she was. Balancing motherhood with helping Jacob wasn't easy. I'd often work on book ideas or read drafts while Sophie napped. Jacob and I spent countless nights discussing plots and characters in hushed tones over her crib. Hey, what if the next book is about a little girl who finds a magic seashell? I whispered one night while Sophie slept. Jacob, looking at our daughter, smiled softly. That's perfect. She could hear the ocean, or better yet, it grants wishes. I nodded, scribbling the idea down. Simple and sweet. Kids will love it. Time passed in a blur of book signings and bedtime stories. Sophie grew, and so did Jacob's career, but we made sure our family time was sacred. Sunday mornings were ours, pancakes and pajamas, no work talk allowed. One Sunday, as we were all in the kitchen, Jacob flipping pancakes and me setting the table, Sophie tugged at my leg. "Mommy, can I help Daddy?" I lifted her up and set her on the counter where Jacob could see her. "Sure, sweetie. Daddy could use a good sous chef." Jacob handed her a small spoon. "Okay, boss, tell me where to flip next." Watching them, a feeling of contentment washed over me. This was it. The dream wasn't just the books or the recognition, it was this. Family. Laughter over spilled syrup and Sophie's delighted claps when a pancake landed just right. 20 years of marriage had flown by in a whirlwind of pages and print. With Jacob's writing career in full bloom, thanks to my ghostwriting and his charm in interviews, we had built a comfortable life. I had left my job long ago, pouring my energy into our home, our daughter Sophie, and the books that bore Jacob's name but carried my spirit. That evening, we were at a grand celebration for Dad's 70th birthday at a chic restaurant, a mingling hub of relatives and Dad's publishing colleagues. The atmosphere was vibrant, the clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversations, creating a lively backdrop. I kept close to Sophie, who, at 17, was more interested in her phone than the gathering. Occasionally, my eyes strayed across the room where Jacob was, inevitably drawn to his magnetic presence. Tonight, however, he seemed preoccupied, his attention consistently captured by a young woman with an effortless elegance that made her stand out even in the crowded room. "Who's that with Jacob?" I found myself asking Dad as we stood by the buffet, my eyes discreetly pointing towards the duo. "Oh, that's Laura. She's the new assistant editor at the firm. Been quite helpful to Jacob with his recent projects," Dad explained, his voice indifferent, lost in the normalcy of work relationships. I nodded, a tight smile concealing the churn of unease. "Seems like they've got a lot to talk about." Dad patted my shoulder, his attention already snagging on another arriving guest. "Work's work, Em. He's probably just discussing book stuff. Don't think too much into it." The rest of the evening saw me floating from one group to another, laughter peppering my conversations, yet my gaze involuntarily tracking Jacob's movements. He laughed at something Laura said, his hand lightly touching her back, and my heart sank into an uncomfortable place. Sophie tugged at my sleeve, her eyes rolling. "Can we go yet? This is super boring, and all these old people keep asking about college." "Just a little longer, honey. It's Grandpa's big day," I reminded her, squeezing her hand, trying to drink in her youthful discontent to distract myself from the hollow feeling growing inside me. As the party wore on, the image of Jacob and Laura together became etched into my mind, a nagging reminder that things in perfect-looking gardens aren't always what they seem. I watched them, telling myself it was nothing, just work. But the little voice in my head wasn't buying it. It whispered doubts, seeded suspicions that no amount of rationalizing could quell. The evening air was chilly as the party for Dad's 70th birthday wound down. After hours of forced smiles and chit-chat, all I wanted was a moment to myself, a quick escape to the restroom before heading home. As I navigated the dimly lit corridor, a muffled giggle stopped me in my tracks. The sound wasn't just familiar, it was intimate, a sound that sends chills down your spine when you know it shouldn't be coming from your husband. Peeking around the corner, my heart sank. There was Jacob, his arms wrapped around Laura, the young assistant editor he'd supposedly been just working with. They were tucked in a secluded corner, far from the prying eyes of the partygoers, lost in an embrace that left no room for doubt. I froze, the sight striking me like a bolt of lightning. My stomach twisted into knots as I watched them kiss, a long, passionate kiss that seemed to last forever. The betrayal stung, sharp and deep, as I stumbled back, hiding behind a decorative screen. The laughter and music from the party seemed a world away. Their whispers floated over to me, words that twisted the knife further. "Soon, we'll be happy, just a little longer," Jacob murmured to her, his voice low and eager. Laura responded, her voice a sugary poison. "And then you can leave her, right?" "Yeah, just a bit longer," he whispered back. "I've been sick of her for years. Soon, we won't have to hide." I slipped away quietly, my legs shaky as I made my way to the bathroom to splash water on my face, trying to wash away the shock and the hurt. Looking at my reflection in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. Betrayed. Deceived. Made a fool of. When I stepped out, attempting to compose myself, I nearly ran into Dad. His face clouded with concern at the sight of me. "Emily, what's wrong? You look pale as a ghost," he said, his hand on my arm steadying me. I couldn't hold it in any longer. The words tumbled out, messy and raw. "It's Jacob. He's having an affair with Laura. I saw them just now, and they were talking about leaving me once he makes enough money from his next book." Dad's expression hardened, his jaw setting in anger. "First thing tomorrow, we're going to see a detective. We'll get to the bottom of this," he said, a protective fierceness in his tone. "Let's get you and Sophie home. You shouldn't be here a minute longer." Leaving the party, the night air felt even colder, biting as the reality of the situation sunk in. Sophie, oblivious to the storm brewing, chatted about the evening, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying Jacob's betrayal over and over. Jacob didn't come home that night, claiming another late night at work. I knew better now. I lay in bed, the emptiness echoing in the room, planning my next steps. The morning after Dad's birthday bash was a rough start. Dad had arranged for us to meet with a private investigator, Mr. Hammond, who had helped him with some minor publishing fraud cases in the past. When we arrived, Mr. Hammond greeted us with a nod, his office a clutter of files and old newspapers. "George, Emily, what can I do for you today?" His voice was gruff, seasoned by years of digging into other people's dirt. "It's my husband, Jacob. I think he's having an affair," I said, trying to keep my voice steady but feeling it waver under the weight of the words. Mr. Hammond didn't look surprised. Perhaps in his line of work, such revelations were as common as morning coffee. "All right, tell me everything. The more details, the better I can help you." I spilled it all, the party, the overheard conversation, his secretive behaviors over the past months, and his late nights explained away by work that seemed to never end. Dad sat beside me, his face a mask of fury and concern. Mr. Hammond listened, jotting down notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his desk. "I can start looking into this immediately. Surveillance, checking financials, the usual drill. But it will take a few weeks to gather enough evidence." We got the call to come into Mr. Hammond's office on a gloomy Tuesday morning. Walking into his office, the air felt thick with the weight of what was about to be disclosed. Mr. Hammond didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I found quite a bit," he said gruffly, motioning us to sit before he started laying out the evidence he had compiled. First came the photos, Jacob and Laura, not just working late but intimately dining out, walking in the park, entering her apartment, too many moments that they spent wrapped up in each other, far from innocent. Then he handed over a stack of financial statements and receipts. "Your husband has been quite generous with your joint funds," Mr. Hammond said dryly. There were bank transactions showing large sums transferred to Laura's accounts, purchase documents for an upscale apartment in her name, and even a receipt for a new car, gifts from Jacob. As if that wasn't enough, Mr. Hammond played several audio clips of conversations between Jacob and Laura. Their voices, hushed and excited, discussed not just their affair, but future plans. They talked about getting married once my daughter Sophie was old enough, calculating that it would minimize any alimony payments. Mr. Hammond cleared his throat, bringing my attention back to him. "There's enough here to file for divorce, and not just any divorce, one that will favor you heavily given the circumstances. He broke the trust, and the law has provisions for situations like this." The weekend had finally come, the one where everything was supposed to come crashing down. Dad had concocted a plan, inviting Jacob and his mistress, Laura, to his house under the guise of discussing a new book project. They arrived together, Jacob looking confident as ever, Laura slightly uneasy by his side. The moment he saw me standing there in the living room, his face dropped, and panic flickered in his eyes. He made a move as if to leave, but Dad's stern voice stopped him. Sit down, Jacob. We're not done here, Dad commanded, pointing to the chairs strategically placed in front of his desk. Reluctantly, Jacob and Laura sat down, the former still glancing towards the door, as if calculating his chances. Dad then pulled out a folder, thick with the weight of evidence collected over the past weeks by the private investigator. He laid it on the table and slowly began to pull out photographs, one by one, laying them out like a deck of cards that spelled Jacob's downfall. These could make for an interesting book, don't you think? Dad said, his voice calm but with a sharp edge. A tale of deceit, betrayal, all backed by these lovely photos and documents. What a story it would make, published for the whole world to see. Jacob's complexion turned a shade paler with each piece of evidence displayed. He started to speak, a feeble attempt to explain himself, but Dad cut him off, pulling out more receipts, bills, checks, all painting a clear picture of the double life Jacob had been leading. Dad continued, his disappointment and anger resonant in his voice. Remember how you got here, Jacob? Emily wrote those first books that still bring in money. She's been behind you, supporting you, and this is how you repay her? As he spoke, Laura, sitting beside Jacob, began to sob quietly, her hands trembling. Amidst her tears, she whispered, almost too low for me to hear, I'm pregnant. I walked over to Jacob with the divorce papers I had prepared. Sign these, I said firmly, pushing the documents toward him. You're leaving with nothing. The house, the savings, the rights to the books, all stay with me. Laura looked up, her eyes wide with fear. I turned to her, my voice cold but clear. And you, I will sue if you don't give up the car and any money Jacob gave you. You can keep the apartment, I'm leaving it to you out of pity for your condition. She nodded frantically, wiping her tears, and quickly agreed, signing whatever I put in front of her. Jacob tried to protest, his voice shaky. This isn't fair. I deserve. Before he could finish, Dad picked up his phone and held it up. Shall I call my friends at the publishing houses, Jacob? How about the major bookstore chains? Let's see how your career will develop in the future. Seeing no way out, Jacob's resistance crumbled. He signed the papers, his hand trembling as he did so. With each stroke of his pen, my future started clearing from the fog of betrayal. The dust had settled, and the silence of the house seemed to echo louder than ever. It was just me now, and Sophie, who was away at college, leaving me to the quiet that wrapped around the rooms like a thick blanket. The finality of it all hadn't fully sunk in yet, the divorce papers signed and delivered, Jacob a part of my past, and my new life waiting to be shaped. I began by taking down every last photograph that included Jacob, replacing them with artwork that Sophie and I had picked out together, and photos of my friends, family, and the many kids I'd helped as a psychologist. One afternoon, Dad came over. So, what's the plan now? You going back to work, or got something else in mind? I paused, a book in hand, and turned to him. I've been thinking about that. I want to write, Dad. Not just ghostwrite, but really write, my name on the books this time. That's my girl, Dad said proudly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. What about? Children's books. But this time, stories that deal with real feelings, challenges kids face growing up. I've seen enough in my practice to know what's missing out there, I explained, excited by the idea that was slowly taking shape in my mind. The following weeks were a blur of activity. I started outlining ideas, jotting down story arcs in the early hours of the morning when the world was quiet, and my thoughts were loud. One evening, Sophie called. She'd been my rock, her calls filled with encouragement and her own college adventures. Hey, Mom, how's the book coming along? It's actually going great, sweetie. It's like once I started, I couldn't stop. I've already outlined 3 stories. I shared, the excitement in my voice mirrored by hers. That's awesome. I can't wait to read them. And Mom, I'm proud of you, you know? Not many could bounce back like you have. Her words warmed my heart, a reminder of how far I'd come. Thanks, honey. That means a lot. I think it's going to be something special. As the months passed, the book took shape, a tangible symbol of my new life. It was filled with tales of courage, understanding, and growth, lessons I'd learned the hard way but was now sharing through characters that children could look up to and learn from. On the day the first copy of my book arrived, I held it in my hands, the title gleaming under my name, Emily Martin. It was more than just a book, it was a testament to my journey, to the resilience of the human spirit, and to a future filled with promise.